Hi, good evening. It's Thinking Slow. We wanted to put a presentation together about the effectiveness of boosters and what is going on with Omicron. I think you've seen we just did some deep dive on Denmark, but we actually, over the last couple of days, collected a fair bit of data from different countries. And I think this presentation will probably give you the most comprehensive view there is about what the data is on boosters. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because we get these empty phrases that they increase protection. And, what does that actually mean? Hands up, anyone that knows what that means. I certainly didn't. And this data will actually show you what's going on with that. What does it mean, this increased protection, from what to what, basically, and for how long? Things politicians will never tell you, because when you actually look at the data, it's kind of hair-raising what kind of additional protection you really do get from this. And also on Omicron, we wanted to pick up again on the point that there really has to be an answer to the question, why is the incidence of Omicron higher in the vaccinated, significantly higher in the vaccinated than the unvaccinated? And I think if you make it through to the end of this video, you will be probably some of the best informed people anywhere about what data is available, and you'll be able to look at it across multiple countries and multiple analysis. And that'll put you in a really strong position to make decisions for yourselves. Do you listen to the politicians? And again, the point of the channel, and in a way this presentation as well, is not to get into the weeds of statistical details and numbers. It's to really understand. Ultimately, the question is, do you trust your leaders? And the point of illustrating what they say with the data that we're able to produce is to answer that question. It's not necessarily to bicker about effectiveness of this vaccine with this age group, because those kind of discussions can go on forever and essentially get nowhere. But let's get into the data set, because I think they're really interesting, and I think the conclusions may blow you away, I think, by the end of the presentation. So, here's the quick agenda. We're going to gallop through Denmark, Germany, Ontario, England, and then wrap up with the conclusions. So Denmark, we've already done a separate video about, and I wanted to highlight this whole working document here, a PDF, which describes all of the sources of data and the workings and everything else. And at some point, I will put the Excel file up there, so there's full transparency into what we've been doing here, because we can't exclude that we may have misread something in Danish and put the wrong number in the wrong column somewhere. I don't think that's true, but to make sure that's transparent, the workings will go up as well. And basically what we're talking about here is comparing the distribution of cases of Omicron versus the distribution of the numbers of people in those different categories, 1 dose, 2 dose, boosted and unvaccinated. And I think it's fairly obvious from a mathematical point of view that if you get a bigger share in the population than you have a share in the number of cases, then this particular group, in this case the unvaccinated, will have a lower incidence of Omicron versus other groups. I think that makes sense. So that's really ultimately all you're looking at is, okay, if these guys are 21.6% of the population, are they more or less than 21.6% of the cases? Now, if they're less, then they have a lower incidence compared to other groups, because they're sort of underrepresented in the share of cases. And this was from the paper that we've referenced here, which was the very, very early group of Omicron cases, and we've updated this number, but I don't need to go through the update, because it basically ends up with quite similar outcomes. And again, the conclusion from this one is basically the incidence of Omicron in the vaccinated is very much higher, roughly double uh, the level that is in the unvaccinated. And the sort of additional protection you get from a third shot is not very significant. And just wanted to make a footnote here that basically this number here is quite flattering for the boosted, because we took the position as of a point in time, which was the day before these case numbers were analysed. And in reality, we should have taken an average, and with an average, you'd get less people boosted, because the level of the numbers of people being boosted are going up quite quickly. So if you take an average position, this number will be lower, which will push this up. But eventually, you're not going to change the conclusion that there is some advantage, but it's not very significant, and we can see that in the German figures, which are kind of interesting as well. So this is the German figures, and we've used again exactly the same methodology. So the Robert Koch Institute has basically provided a breakdown of Omicron cases by vaccination category, and we've matched that up with the numbers of people in those vaccination categories and divided one number by the other to work out incidence. It's an open question why they didn't do that, because it's an obvious question. I'm not sure why neither the Danish authorities or the German authorities include that calculation in their analysis. But anyway, it's meant something for us to do, and that's what we've done. This is the source of the data on vaccination, and you can just look this up through Google. It's linked to Our World in Data. We've checked it very thoroughly for Denmark, and this does match back to the Danish numbers, and we assume this is all fine for the German numbers as well. And here, this is a percent of the whole population, so there's none of these questions about is this over 12, over 18, is it excluding the under 5s. This is basically a percentage of everybody, and that's better because we want to match up case numbers that are applicable to everybody with vaccination status that's applicable to everybody. And once you start getting into under 12, over 12, it gets quite confusing, so we don't want to get into that. So this is then the exact same methodology that we applied for Denmark. These are the vaccination numbers 27th of December that you can see exactly in this chart. They've changed slightly since we did the screen grab, so there's a couple of thousand difference here and there, but these are the numbers, and as we put in the methodology paper, we don't need to go through it all again. You can work out how many are 1 dose only, 2 dose only, boosted, and then the implied unvaccinated is the total population less total first dose. So that gives you the numbers of people in those different categories. This time we had a bit more time, so we did do the average position, which is more, as I said, is more accurate. And as you can see here, basically what it's done is reduced the number of boosted, because if we look at that chart again, you can't see it under here, but it's the dark green. But from, I think it was the 21st of November or so was that Robert Koch data, but from there to the 27th of December, it's gone up a lot, basically. So you need to work out the average in the period to make this accurate. I hope that's reasonably clear. So the average is lower than the position at 27th of December. So here are the breakdown of the Omicron cases by vaccination category. There's quite a big backstory to this that I'm not going to get into on this video probably, but there was a Reuters fact check involved in this, where some people had used a lower number because that was actually the number they actually published, and then Reuters called out the people using that number as misinformation, although Robert Koch actually printed a different number and then made a mistake. So it was the Robert Koch Institute mistake, not the people using that data. So they actually, the Institute then updated that number to this number, which is the latest version, which is what we've used. So it's the same story again, basically. Looking at the unvaccinated, that's 28% of the total population. They account for 21% of the Omicron cases, so that's a lower share than they are of the population. Therefore, you end up with an incidence rate which is lower than the other groups. And, it's less than double in this case, but it's 50% higher in the fully vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. And in this case, the incidence rate in the boosted group using the average is actually slightly higher than the unvaccinated. So that's a bit of a question mark on the effectiveness of the booster. And again, as we said in the last video, the important thing is if you're starting from here, you actually have to get here before getting to there. And that's something we'll go into. You have to look at the whole journey, which involves firstly increasing your risk and then getting a sort of fairly marginal decrease, at least from here to here. But it's enough to say right now, because it's still early days with these numbers, that these two numbers are comparable. So there's no obvious advantage to getting boosted, at least if you start off from an unvaccinated position. So let's do Ontario also. Then this is quite good because it's in a chart format and the link is provided at the end to the paper. But this is saying again exactly the same thing, that the light blue dots are Omicron, and basically this is the 2-dose group. And you can see this when you get into negative effectiveness, that means you basically have more probability of catching Omicron or being an Omicron case than you have as an unvaccinated person. So in here it goes to -40. So there's you'll have basically, roughly speaking, you have 40% more chance of catching Omicron if you've had 2-dose fully vaccinated, or what used to be called fully vaccinated. So this fits in quite nicely with the 1.54 figure that we calculated from the RK Institute data. This is similar, but this has been done professionally by proper biostatisticians, whereas we just sort of divided one number by the other, but the outcome was the same, essentially. This ticks up a little bit at the end. I'm not quite sure why that is, but the message is you've got negative effectiveness. And that's a big question. I mean, people have not been asking this question. We really need to know why the double-dose vaccinated are more susceptible to catching Omicron than the unvaccinated. Now, there's quite a bit of theory about that we're not maybe going to get into here. But if you look at the trials of coronavirus vaccines over the last 11 years or so, this is what happens. You basically make the vaccine for the first strain, the wild type, and then when you've had a bunch of mutations, a new strain comes along, and the vaccinated are actually in worse shape than the unvaccinated. Now, we need to get hold of a real expert to talk that point through, but it's certainly a big question about why this is happening. And it is a red flag that, of course, the politicians are ignoring. Then the second part of this chart is not necessarily really related to this part. This is a standalone piece related to the 2-dose vaccinated. This is what happens with the booster shot, basically, and I'm just going to do this one in between these tram lines, which is a sort of average one booster. This is the third shot with an mRNA vaccine. So they have this in quite a short time period, but basically the first 6 days there's no impact whatsoever, which is not, I suppose, that amazing. But then day 7 onwards, and they haven't broken this down anymore, you get up to 40% effectiveness. Now, again, that's pretty consistent with what we looked at in Germany and Denmark, that yes, there is some benefit, but it's not, it's not significant, and it's not above a sort of standard 50% effectiveness threshold that you would normally consider, as far as I understand, to be a sort of good vaccine. So that's a question mark. This thing is not particularly high. Um, Now, you can compare that with Delta, and we can argue about the effectiveness against the Delta variant. But, there was some effectiveness. It's silly to argue there wasn't. I think it fell off much more quickly than this. But anyway, you can already see, this booster is not getting you up to the level of effectiveness that you had against the Delta variant, basically. So that we're going to come back to that. That's another interesting question we need to think about, because you're getting not a big benefit, having firstly had quite a negative exposure to increased risk. That's quite an interesting sort of position to be in. I just flicked across them to a paper from the UK. Now, this is in the UK's Health Security Agency, I think it's called now. So this is their version essentially of that same thing for Ontario. This relates to England, and to some extent we got a similar. Obviously, I think you can, if we just flick from one to the other, you've got quite a similar pattern. You've got basically reduced effectiveness for the double dose vaccinated, but the difference here is you're only going to zero. Well, I say only. Vaccines should not be going to zero effectiveness after 10. Where are we now? Sort of say 20 weeks. So when I say only zero, I have to pinch myself. That's a crazy number, that vaccine effectiveness would go to nothing quite quickly. But anyway, this does go to zero. I mean, it's negative here already, but it's nowhere near as negative as we saw in the Ontario paper, and it's not as negative as the data suggested from Germany and Denmark. But anyway, it basically is negative. This is for AstraZeneca, and again, the same conclusion. You're more likely to get Omicron if you're double dose vaccinated than unvaccinated. Again, big question, why is that? And then on the booster shot, very different to Ontario, you basically get instant increase in effectiveness, basically. I think we had essentially zero here for this first 6 days, but this one you get this big jump basically. So I guess you go from here to here. I don't think that's realistic in the first week, but I don't know where that data came from. But anyway, by this point, you're above that 40% level that you had in Ontario. But interestingly enough, look at these dots here. They're going down basically. So this was our conclusion on this scenario, which is basically AstraZeneca with this booster. Yeah, okay, this doesn't look very realistic, but it goes up to 60%. Not huge. I don't think we've denied there'd be some benefit, but then of course, look at this thing, 10 weeks, and you're already on this trajectory. So this is very interesting and worrying at the same time, because I think we're going to put all those pieces together, and I think this will be the conclusion that sort of makes your hair stand on end. And again, as much as we can say, bearing in mind what platform we're on, we can't say everything we'd like to say, so this is self-censored as well. So just before leaving the English data, I wanted to say why I'm very cautious about anything coming from the UK Health Security Agency. And the reason is that they use these assumptions on vaccine effectiveness, and there's just no actual data to support these assumptions. If you look at cases, I think it's now widely accepted that for the vast majority of the UK, the incidence of COVID is very much higher in the double dose vaccinated than in the unvaccinated. So you have that negative effectiveness. And in fact, I could just probably flick, look at this, this is what they claim effectiveness for double dose against Delta. I mean, it starts at 80 and goes to 40. But in this table, they're still claiming, okay, it's 60 to 70%, maybe, but again, that's assuming this is accurate. Um, so that one is maybe within range, to be fair. But certainly on these ones, they don't work at all, basically, because on hospitalization, we went through all that palaver with the intensive care units that the number of 9 out of 10 units was completely false. And it's a fact that around about 80-85% of inpatients in Wales are fully vaccinated. So this doesn't make sense. And mortality also, about 85% of deaths with COVID are fully vaccinated. So this doesn't make sense either. So that's why I'm suspicious of UK Health Security Agency, and that's why I'm a little bit. I would actually rather go with those Ontario figures than with the English figures. But anyway, let's just now bring this all together. So, that was quite a big gallop around 4 countries. I hope you'd appreciate it. It took quite a bit of time to put the work together. But basically, you've got a pretty clear pattern, I would say, of much more likelihood of catching Omicron if you're double dosed vaccinated than unvaccinated. And the booster, yes, it probably provides something, but it doesn't look very robust in terms of a 50% threshold. Now, nobody knows what's going to happen, I guess, going forward, but if you look at the way the effectiveness went to zero or negative for the Delta variant, we're talking like 20 weeks. Why not? Why wouldn't you have that again with the Omicron variant? So now, if you sort of put it together conceptually, what you're doing with your boosters, you're actually getting less. Firstly, you're starting off with much higher risk than the unvaccinated of actually catching the disease. So you're starting with 1 foot in the hole, basically. So you move from there up to a position where you get even less effectiveness than you had with the Delta variant, basically. Now, if that starts tailing off, and it looked like on that other chart it was tailing off already, you're basically in a downward spiral. You're basically sort of netting yourself out of a hole, netting up to a point which is lower than the point that you had before, and you're jumping back into that downward cycle, basically, of effectiveness falling to zero, even going negative. So I think, if you do that as an iteration, you could probably put a formula together, but you can see that's a downward spiral, right? Does that make sense? You sort of dig yourself out of a hole, don't get all the way up, and then start going back into the hole quite quickly. And I think that is the reality of when they say get added protection. They will never tell you that your chances of getting Omicron already increased by being double vaccinated. But then the benefit you get will actually be relatively modest, and based on the previous experience, it won't be very long-lived. And I think that's really what we wanted to say about what does this word protection mean. And as I said, this is probably, as far as we can see, the road to nowhere, essentially going along like this. And that was really it. We just wanted to wrap up with some conceptual things because, again, the details of numbers. I mean, they're interesting only in the fact that we're trying to expose or explain that these buzzwords you hear from the politicians don't really mean anything. And those numbers actually give you a picture of what we're really talking about. What is this added protection? How long will it last? What does it mean? What's the scale of what we're looking at? But the important thing is, again, the context. Now, what these guys keep doing, and we've seen over and over again, is to come up with crazy projections, ludicrously exaggerated. That exaggerated picture does not come to pass, and they'll say, well, look what a good job we've done because, we don't have 10,000 deaths, we got 1,000, so we're geniuses, basically. Now, that relies on, lending some credence to the models, which is the first mistake, but it really relies on the fact that you can't do this so-called counterfactuals, so you just don't know what would have happened. You can't we can run an experiment by looking at different countries, but one counterfactual you've got is what happened in the past. And this is the 1957 to 1958 pandemic. And just, it was a bad pandemic. And it came and it went, basically. There was no 24/7 news coverage. There was no panic. There was no lockdown. There was no stupid modeling. There was no mass vaccination. And look what happened. The same as every single other pandemic in human history. It was resolved through natural immunity. Now you can apply tools and everything else if they actually help. But I'm seriously asking the question on a counterfactual basis, is all the stuff that we've done counterproductive? I'm absolutely certain it is. I've got data to prove that. So when the politicians tell you what a great job you've done, always remember that without those guys and without these policy responses, pandemics resolve themselves like this one did. This is the pattern of a pandemic. Build up robust natural immunity that we know for sure is significantly better than the vaccine-induced immunity, and develop herd immunity and move on. And of course, this time, the people who feel ill isolate, not people who have been asymptomatic, and the vulnerable are protected. So this is the counterfactual. So if a politician wants to claim credit for something, they need to, this is the counterfactual. It's not, we got some guys at Warwick to do a ludicrous model, that model didn't happen, haven't we done well? That's not the way it should work. So, and then the last point is our point that we always like to make, and I like this quote, I've seen it floating around. Realistically, at no time in history have the people forcing others into compliance been the good guys. And that needs a bit of thinking about. People are being fired for not doing as they're told. The Northern Territory in Australia has gone completely off the edge of the cliff. The unvaccinated can't leave their homes, basically, for any reason. They're not allowed to go to work. I mean, this is really as bad as it gets, more or less. I mean, how many steps are we from people turning up your door and holding you down? And, every time we're told that's completely crazy, it can never happen, lo and behold, 4 months later that happens. So, look at the trajectory of where we are, basically, and look at the character of the people doing those things. And I certainly think, looking back at history, these are not the good guys. These are using these methods, and the applied psychology indicates this is not the good guys running the show at the moment. So, as I said before many times, don't stay safe, stay free, because without your freedom, you don't have safety. Thank you. And if you like the sources for this material, I'm going to let you have a screenshot. They're all in the appendix. We'll post this up. But if you want to do a screenshot, this is where all the data came from, basically. And the slideshow will be posted up as well. And please subscribe. Grab someone today and say, hey, look, these guys produce some data. They provide the underlying statistics and the sources of the information. Grab one person and get them to subscribe, and that'll really help us as well. And follow us on Twitter. Thanks. Bye.